So in this video, we'll continue to look at this subject of Darwin and the history of his theory of natural selection. Today, we're going to delve a little bit more into Darwin himself, and then we'll talk about how natural selection works, and then a few other topics. So before we can do that, we have to define what a population is. It's because evolution occurs in populations over time. It does not occur to individuals. So like that would be a Lamarckian idea again, that an individual can change because they are desirous of that change, whereas Darwinian evolution and natural selection happens to populations over time. So let's talk a little bit about Charles Darwin, the person. He was born in 1809, the same day that Abraham Lincoln was born, February 12th, 1809. He went to college to become a doctor at 16, kind of following in the steps of his family, but chose not to pursue that because he just did not want anything to do with medicine. But he was really into nature, and so he became a naturalist. He also was studying to become a priest at the time because it was pretty common for those kinds of professions to intertwine. A lot of naturalists were priests, and medicine and clergy and law and all those things kind of combined in those days because those were generally the only subjects that you studied in college. So here's just showing you a picture of where he was from. But he ended up not going to seminary. Instead, he went on a trip with a guy by the name of Robert Fitzroy. Again, name's not important, but it's just interesting for history. And they went together on a little boat called the HMS Beagle. And they went around the world. Here's a picture of the Beagle, just an artist rendition, of course. And they went around the world, and it took them 5 years. And so, in doing so, Darwin collected plants and animals and fossils on pretty much every stop as they went around the world. And he took with him those books that we talked about, The Principles of Geology by Lyell and The Principles of Populations by Thomas Malthus. And on his voyage, of course, studying and figuring out all of these ideas concerning animals, particularly as he saw animals in similar types of environments having similar types of adaptations. Of course, the finches there on the Galapagos Islands and those sorts of things. He published his book in 1859 called On the Origin of Species, one of the most influential books ever published. And so in Darwin's book, he talked about the theory of natural selection and what causes natural selection. And he actually didn't use the word evolution very many times. He actually coined this term descent with modification. And it's essentially the same kind of idea. Descent indicates that you have these long periods of time that are required to bring about the kind of modifications that would occur in a species to allow that species to evolve and to survive. And so when we use the word evolution, we're really just talking about a change that occurs over time, and that change occurs to populations. So if you want a full, really simple definition of the word evolution, it's just a change in populations over time. We will amend that a little bit as we get into the subject of microevolution, but it's essentially the same kind of idea. Now, before we talk about artificial selection, we'll go back here and talk a little bit more about natural selection. And so with natural selection, the idea here is that there's basically, and the way Darwin described it, is that there's different levels of success in reproduction. And that is based on a creature's ability to survive. And so he used this term called fitness. And fitness would be defined as an organism's ability to survive and successfully reproduce. And so if an organism is able to survive in their environment and successfully produce offspring, then that is a fit organism. Not all individuals of a population are able to do that. And so the idea is those that have the strongest traits are able to do that. Those with the weakest traits will not be able to do that, and therefore those strongest traits will move on. It's the environment that is going to change the success rate of those individuals. There's different environmental pressures that will be put on, food, predation. There's a lot of different natural stressors, weather, just climate in general. And so as those environmental pressures change, you would expect the populations to change as well. And that is the whole idea, that either a population will change and adapt, and those animals that are most fit will survive, and those traits that continue on will be the traits that are in the next generation. So in that way, populations evolve, not individuals. Again, don't think of this as the rabbit's getting tired of being eaten, and so he gets faster. And again, it just doesn't make sense. If there's 10 rabbits and 2 of them are fast enough to beat the fox, those 2 rabbits are going to reproduce, and guess what the next generation is going to be? They're going to be faster. And so then what do you need? You need foxes that are better. And so they kind of come up together in a sense. And so this kind of struggle for existence, this is what Malthus talked about as well. This is what fuels evolution, that there is death and there is survival, and those that survive and reproduce, those traits are going to go on. And so there's 4 basic tenets to natural selection and these are if you want to sum up natural selection in a very simple, succinct way, these are the 4 ways to do that. That there are more individuals that are produced in each generation than can survive. And so this would be Malthus, right? There's going to be 100 individuals produced each generation, but only 50 of them are going to be able to survive based on resources. And so which 50 are going to survive? The strongest. And so that's the second tenet, is that there is variation that exists among those individuals, and that variation is inheritable. And then so the third tenet is those individuals with better inheritable traits are going to be the ones that survive. And so 1 is more are produced than can survive. 2, there's variation. 3, the better variations are going to survive. And then 4, those better variations are also going to reproduce and thus pass those traits on to the next generation. That differs from artificial selection, because with natural selection, those 4 things that I just outlined are happening in nature. There's not a random to it either, and so we don't need to think of natural selection as random. We will talk about some random elements that can enter into populations, but natural selection is not a random. The fastest rabbit wins. It doesn't get eaten. It's not random. Artificial selection is where there are other traits that may be selected for, and that we are the selectors, not nature. And so this is where we have decided we like this particular type of trait, and then we select those. The best examples, of course, are domesticated plants and animals. Here, this is a picture of some plants that all were selectively bred from the wild mustard plant. We know these as like our cauliflower, broccoli, kale, Brussels sprouts, all those sorts of things. And they were selected for certain traits and eventually made into their own breeds of this plant. The same with domesticated dogs and cows and all the other things that we've domesticated. We have chosen the traits that we like, gotten rid of the ones that we don't, by not selecting for those, by not breeding them together. All right. And so this doesn't necessarily create the best survival traits. If you think about dogs, if you put the little yip dogs out in the forest, they're going to be food. But if you put a bigger, like German Shepherd or something like that out there, it's going to be fine. It's going to be able to do that because it has better traits for survival. So you get the idea. And there's some artificial selection animals, of course, with sheep. What have we selected for? Wool. And so the sheep that have the most wool, we have selected those, and we continue to do that. And then we have sheep that produce so much wool that if they fall over, they can't even get up. All right, so let's talk a little bit about supporting evidences for common ancestry. And we'll use the word common ancestry. What we're talking about is, like you and your first cousins have a common ancestor. It's your grandparents. And so we would think about mammals. Mammals have a common ancestor, and it's that first mammal long ago. Or we have a common ancestor with some primates, and it's the first primates. Whereas the common ancestor of primates and other monkeys is some other monkey. And so evolution occurs through this common ancestry thing. There's a lot of someone will say, well, people came from monkeys. Well, that's not necessarily the case. There was a common ancestor between chimps and the most recent common ancestor of our own species. And so that's not how, we don't need to think of it as came from. We need to think about sharing this common ancestry is a better way to think about it. And so one evidence of that common ancestry is something called homologous structures. And these are structures. The best way to think about them is they have the same kinds of structures, but not necessarily the same functions. The example that you're going to see almost every time is the vertebrate forearm. We are vertebrates. Vertebrates are things that have backbones. And so particularly the mammalian forearm, as you can see here, we have the one on the left is our own arm, and then you have the cat and whale and the bat. And notice you have the same structures. Just look at the color code there. We have 2 forearm bones, we have the digits and all that kind of thing. But what's going on? They all have different functions. I use my hand to grab things. Bats use their hands to fly. And so different functions, but same structures. And so these same structures, or these homologous structures, show common ancestry. Another thing that shows common ancestry is embryological homologies. And so basically, the way you read this graph is 3 embryos along, or the different embryos along the top row are all similar if you look at them. But as you go down, looking at each column, there's a different result. And so what's the idea here? Is that we all start out similarly and then change through our embryological development. And the idea here is that embryological development kind of mimics our evolutionary changes. At the very earliest stages of our development, we all have things like gills and a tail. Well, we lose both of those things, whereas fish keep both of those things. And so there's some similarities there, and this shows common ancestry. And then, of course, more recently, is in the last 100 years or so, or even more recently than that, we have begun to see molecular homologies. And this is comparing, look at this particular picture here. It shows the number of amino acids that are the same in a different, or that differ between human hemoglobin and others. And so between us and the rhesus monkey, there's only 8 amino acids difference, whereas between us and the lamprey, there's 125. And so that shows all of those species have hemoglobin. It's just not all of their hemoglobin is made the same. And you'd expect the ones that have closer hemoglobin to be more closely related than others. That you could do this with DNA. You could do this with any kind of protein. There's a lot of different molecular homologies that you could draw. And then there's the concept of biogeography. And this is what Darwin really hung his hat on. The idea that, in Australia, you find the sugar glider, and in North America, you find the flying squirrel. They are very similar organisms because they have very similar environments within which to thrive. And so similar kinds of environments, you're going to expect to have similar kinds of creatures in them. And this is the idea of convergent evolution. And if you think about two lines converging, that means that they're getting ready to come together. Now, with convergent evolution, this doesn't mean that these two species are going to become one species. You need to think of this as they're converging because there's a similar kind of environment. And so those two different animals are going to exhibit similar traits. And so I may have another picture for this. I don't. And the next picture works for this too, though. But you think about all organisms that live in the water. What would be an example of convergent evolution there? Well, they all have fins, or they all have some kind of way to help propel them through the water. Whales are mammals, fish are fish, yet both have fins because fins are good for flipping through the water. And so fish and whales share a very distant common ancestor, but those same kinds of traits are going to come around because that function is necessary. This is the opposite of a homologous structure. These are called analogous structures. So an analogous structure is where the function is going to be the same, yet the structures are not necessarily the same at all. And so wings are another great example of this. And so birds fly, bugs fly. The reason that they fly is it allows them to escape predation, allows them to be predators of themselves better. And these are both, flight is created for similar reasons, yet it's created two completely different reasons along these different evolutionary tracks. Insects and birds are very distantly related in that they are both animals, and that's about it. All right. Yet they show these similar structures. And so anytime we see analogous structures, that is going to point to convergent evolution as well. And so a little bit more fossil evidence as well. With fossils, you can see the past as well, and you can see the past and the future is the one way to think about it. If you look at fossil evidence of like ancient whales, for instance, they had these legs. Whereas today, what would you expect to see in whales? Well, you'd expect to see some remnant of those legs. And that's exactly what you see. Those remnants that you find are called vestigial structures. Those vestigial structures are something that may have been needed in the past, but now are slowly disappearing. So we think of, like our own tailbone, for instance. We no longer have a tail, yet we do have a bone that seems to suggest that there may have been one there at one time. Wisdom teeth are a great example of this. Our jaws are no longer very long because our skulls have shortened up quite a bit, yet some of us still grow teeth that don't quite fit, and so we have to get them removed. But what would you expect? There are some people that don't have wisdom teeth, and you'd expect that trend to actually increase. So this picture just shows how fossils are formed, but that's it on this video. In the next video, we'll begin talking about microevolution.